After the break, we meet the book's translator, Canaan Morse, who says translation is a crucial but often misunderstood art. What he meant? Well, stay tuned.
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines.
Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. In the first part of today's program, I talked to Chinese novelist Ge Fei, whose 2007 book, Peach Blossom Paradise, was translated and published in English last year and became a finalist for this year's National Book Award for Translated Literature. Now let's meet the translator, Canaan Morse, who has done the first English translation of Ge Fei's work, The Invisibility Cloak, nearly a decade ago. It won him the Susan Sontag Prize for translation in 2014 in the US. Since falling in love with China at the age of 5, according to Morse, he has dedicated his life so far to the study of Chinese culture. While studying in China, he co-founds Pathlight Magazine, which introduces contemporary Chinese poetry to English readers. Now back in the US, Morse is a PhD candidate at Harvard with a focus on late imperial Chinese literature. Morse told me he thinks translation is a vital but often misunderstood art. What does he mean? Let's find out. I'm joined now by Canaan Morse, literary translator, poet, and PhD candidate at Harvard University. Canaan, what a pleasure to see you. You know, a writer would work sometimes not necessarily controlling everything that he wrote. And at the end of the day, in retrospect, he might have different interpretations of what he really meant, really. When you consulted with him and work in that style, you know, I'm sure there are some interesting messages coming out about his writing, about how he works, and about how English and Chinese languages work.
One of the important, I should say, corollary advantages of communicating frequently with an author as a translator is that it builds an atmosphere of trust. I trust him and he trusts me. And I value his respect and his trust so much that it motivates me to be a better translator. As one famous translator said, when I create a translated document, 100% of the words that I use are not the words in the original text.
That's true.
I think people get caught on that a lot, but it's important to realize that it is a process of multi-vocal recreation.
You talk about recreation. Actually, there's also a process of co-creation. Because as a translator, you also need to work out the storyline with your own understanding and put it out in a language that you are familiar with to the readers you are targeting at. And try to explain things sometimes that is not in the original text. So that's a very interesting, way of working for translators everywhere.
For instance, if someone says, 我不会当你的陈世美, okay? This is so 陈世美, right? We have here a character from ancient Chinese history who is an unfaithful husband, like he's sort of like an inconstant lover, right? And what I will do, actually, I may use the name in English, but I would probably fortify the meaning by changing the verbs around it so that my reader understands that the person is saying, I'm not going to abandon you. And every context is different. I mean, the thing about translation is that every sentence is different. Every sentence involves different choices. But within those choices, we have the space to include information in a way that's not like totally obvious, that is included, that is culturally specific. We don't have to use footnotes. People used to use footnotes, but we no longer do that because it's kind of hard
distracting.
to read.
Yeah. Tell me more about how difficult and challenging Ge Fei's works are, and how is that uniquely different and challenging from the other works you've been trying to translate?
One of the reasons that I love translating Ge Fei's work is his incredible degree of succinctness. What the style we describe in Chinese as 凝练. He can put an incredible amount of information into a very, very small amount of language. I started translating his work with a much more recent book called 隐身衣, The Invisibility Cloak. And, that's a novella of only 68,000 characters or so, and it feels like a whole novel. And the same is true of Peach Blossom Paradise. I mean, there's just so much in there. And it's beautiful and moving prose in Chinese. It just means that there's a lot of pressure on me to create an English style that will communicate that same level of intensity.
Then, Canaan, how did you find that style?
Through practice and communication and editorship. My editor, Jeffrey Yang at New York View Books, he's an amazing reader, and without his...
What is an amazing reader to you?
An amazing reader to me is someone who can look at a draft translation and see where it's probably missing something or where it could be better, even when they're not looking at an original.
You would not lose that much in translation as long as you're only reading it, literally. But you could feel, if your reader is bilingual, there is some loss of spirit or loss of real essence, loss of cross-cultural communication, loss of colloquialism, and the list goes on in the translation. And that's something that no translator could escape, right? Nobody could escape. Only the degree varies. So how do you face that, particularly with Ge Fei's work, who, as you said, wrote in a way that is so concise and precise, and with a lot of cultural context?
So translation, if we think about it historically, translation has been with us since the dawn of human civilization.
Sure.
And it is translation, in fact, it is one of the ways in which most cultures find new energy, is through translation. We've been translating each other's work, other humans' work, since the dawn of time. I would suggest that translation can make a lot of work. It makes for a richer cultural experience, put it that way. There's a very famous quote that people attribute to Robert Frost about poetry being what is lost in translation. Accomplished poets and translators have come back to that and said, well, yes, but without translation, there would be almost no poetry at all. And I think I and a lot of translators who know what it is like to work with an author. I think in a lot of, we talk a lot about loss in translation when we read works that have been translated colonially, in which the translator is stepping in front of the author. But in today's world, a responsible translator knows that you stand next to or behind your author. And when you do that, you're able to work both with content and with style, because you mentioned the phrase literal translation. And I think as anyone who's ever read a Google machine translation knows, when you translate literally, you get unreadable work. And, with most authors, it's just as much about how you say what you say as it is about what you say. You know, style is the message, and they want to work with literary people, writers, translators who understand that and who can replicate context. I mean, so much of reading a story is not just about the specific information on the page, it's about recreating the feeling of reading a story. When I read 人面桃花, how do I feel? Like,
how
does
do
that
you feel?
context? I love unhappy stories. I don't like happy endings. And this is
That's not very Chinese. We love a double happiness.
It's true, but I'm sorry to tell you, no one gets married at the end of this story.
Okay.
But it's like it's so complex and dark and like mysterious. Like you can see, reading the Jiangnan Sanbuqu, you can see that his trilogy, you can see where the Invisibility Cloak and all the later work comes from, like his ability to create suspense and work with darkness and uncertainty.
To the other generations of writers in China, Mr. Ge Fei is still very active, shall I say even proactive, in both writing the works and, you know, interact with societies, teaching students. And some of his peers of the same generation are doing the same at various degrees in different ways. So how do you, you know, look at a whole Google map of Chinese contemporary literature and locate these guys or these ladies on the map?
Ge Fei's generation of authors have been through many different literary movements and historical movements. And one of the things you notice about his generation, particularly of prose writers, is they started out, many of them, writing sort of broad scope historical fiction. So if we look at Ge Fei, we look at Mo Yan, we look at Jia Pinghua, this generation of prose authors, they each have at least one major piece of history spanning historical fiction. So there's a certain concern with change and continuity that moved them to write really sweeping narratives at one point. And many of these authors, having done that, have then gone back to focus on more sort of micro issues, sort of like core moments of human experience. And that's been an interesting change to watch.
Like what? What are these core moments of human experience?
For instance, like I think a lot of those writers were deeply affected by the changes that occurred in Chinese society in terms of reform and opening up. When people had things to buy, when there's so much more stuff to buy, when there was so much more money to make, and when people started to change some of their priorities based on their capabilities, that I think has really hit, especially writers who came from perhaps from rural backgrounds. I think those changes have been extreme and quite new and worthy of attention.
Well, that was my conversation with Canaan Morse, a rising translator now based in the United States, who is fascinated with Chinese culture and certainly literature. His latest translation of Chinese novelist Ge Fei's work has already achieved to be on the short list for this year's National Book Award in the US. That's all we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.